I'm Jeff Kildea and this is Croppies Downunder, a series of vodcasts that looks at some of the more arcane aspects of the history of the Irish in Australia. In this episode, we will examine a little-known incident that occurred in Sydney during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919. The story concerns a nurse, an archbishop, and a federal health official. It begins on the 3rd of December 1918 with the death of a 27-year-old nurse, Annie Egan, who had volunteered to work at Sydney's quarantine station situated on the northern headland at the entrance to Sydney Harbour. Annie was a devout Catholic from outback New South Wales near Gunnedah, who had completed her training at Sydney's St Vincent's Hospital. She was one of the first victims of Spanish flu in Australia. When Annie fell seriously ill, she asked to see a priest, but no Catholic priests were in the quarantine station at the time. In the months before, a number of priests arriving by ship had been placed in quarantine in accordance with quarantine regulations, but the last of them had by then been discharged. When news of Annie's situation reached the ear of church authorities, a request was made to the quarantine station to allow a priest to visit her. However, Dr. John Elkington, the medical officer in charge of the quarantine station, refused the request. The refusal to allow a priest to administer the last rites to the dying nurse sparked a political controversy that inflamed relations between the Catholic Church and the federal government, relations already strained during the First World War over conscription and Irish Home Rule. At the centre of the controversy was Michael Kelly, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney from 1911 to 1940. During his tenure, Kelly was renowned for his piety, but when it comes to his reputation with regard to politics, it is difficult to find anyone, whether they be a contemporary or a modern historian, who has a good word to say about him. William Holman, Premier of New South Wales from 1913 to 1920, in his memoirs written in 1935, compared Kelly unfavourably with his politically astute predecessor Cardinal Patrick Moran. After praising Moran for his sage advice on matters of state, Holman wrote, "Moran's successor, Archbishop Kelly, whose saintly life was passed in unworldly simplicity, was a churchman of an entirely different stamp. He made no attempt to control the political movements of his flock, and a perplexed party leader who called upon him was much more likely to get wholesome counsel as to the state of his soul and the necessity for a careful searching of his conscience than helpful suggestions as to the best way out of a purely mundane difficulty." In the Australian Dictionary of Biography, Professor Patrick O'Farrell wrote, "Kelly was a strident, uncompromising, but often inept and unnecessarily narrow Catholic leader." The period 1910 to 1925 was a particularly trying one for Catholics in Australia. Ever since the British founded the colony at Sydney in 1788, religious sectarianism between Catholics, mostly of Irish heritage, and Protestants, mostly of British heritage, had been endemic. It reflected old world divisions between Protestants and Catholics that had existed since the Reformation, and between England and Ireland that was of even greater antiquity. In Australia, sectarianism existed mostly in the background, but from time to time the social equilibrium which had come to accommodate this chronic problem was disturbed by acute episodes of sectarian conflict, such as in Melbourne in 1846 and 1867, when shots were fired, and in Sydney in 1878, when there was rioting on St Patrick's Day. The potential for sectarian conflict increased from the 1870s with the introduction of free, compulsory and secular education provided by the state. Motivated by a mixture of conscientious belief and a desire on the part of Irish clergy to sustain Irish community identity, the Catholic community operated its own education system separate from that of the state, thereby reinforcing a sense and a perception of difference. This tendency assumed organised political form in the early 1910s with the founding of Catholic federations. These federations campaigned vigorously in 4 states to try to persuade governments to grant state aid for Catholic schools. That campaign coincided with the push for Irish self-government, which in 1912 saw the introduction of a bill into the House of Commons to give home rule to Ireland. The result was the intensification of the sectarian conflict in Australia, with debate over these controversial issues dividing along ethno-religious lines. With the outbreak of the First World War, sectarian tension noticeably declined as Catholics and Protestants shared in the blood sacrifice of the trenches. But this ironic interlude disappeared following the uprising in Dublin during Easter week 1916 and the divisive debates over conscription during the referendum campaigns of October 1916 and December 1917. Over the next few years, Australian Catholics would be subjected to vitriolic abuse and a series of humiliations as bad as any they had experienced in the previous 120 years. During and after the conscription campaigns, Prime Minister Billy Hughes engaged in a public feud with the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, Daniel Mannix, each blaming the other for the rise of sectarianism. During the squabble, Hughes made many intemperate remarks, seemingly lumping all Catholics together as Sinn Féiners, pro-German and shirkers. In this atmosphere, bigoted pamphleteers commanded a large audience, eager to read their vile propaganda with its relenting attack on Catholics. Commonwealth authorities, who used wartime regulations to silence Catholic anti-conscriptionists, such as the editor of Melbourne's Catholic newspaper The Advocate and the Irish Catholic Premier of Queensland Tom Ryan, claimed that they had no legal basis to stop the dissemination of anti-Catholic literature. The federal government also introduced a tax on bachelors who had not enlisted, but it refused to provide an exemption for priests and teaching brothers who could not marry, leading to strong protests from Catholic bishops and Catholic newspapers. It is no wonder then that during these bitter times many Catholics were hypersensitive to threats to their religious liberty, particularly at the hands of the Commonwealth government. It is in this context that a relatively minor incident, such as that at the quarantine station, could blow up into a full-scale political controversy. The seeds of the controversy were sown in November 1918, following the departure of the last priest in quarantine. Archbishop Kelly applied to the Commonwealth authorities for permission for Father Ruggiero, an Italian priest, to be allowed to take their place and to minister to Catholics in the quarantine station. However, Dr. Elkington, after having interviewed Ruggiero, rejected him as not adapted in temperament. Kelly then wrote to the Defence Minister, Senator George Pearce, requesting that he overrule Elkington's decision. Kelly also approached the Minister for Trade and Customs, Walter Massey Green, whose portfolio included the quarantine service, but to no avail. On the day Nurse Egan died, Massey Green formally refused Kelly's request to appoint a chaplain. Priests were not to be permitted to enter the quarantine station. Kelly reacted decisively. That night he convened a meeting of concerned Catholics at the chapter hall of the cathedral. The meeting resolved to send a strong protest to the government and to make representations to leading members of the House of Representatives, in order that they might raise the matter in Parliament. Kelly also cabled the Defence Minister, proclaiming that Sydney Catholics were indignant at the exclusion of a priest from the quarantine station. Kelly contacted his fellow bishops around Australia, and they in turn expressed their outrage to the government. The Catholic newspapers joined the fray. The Freeman's Journal headlined its report, "An outrage that has shocked Australia," and compared the circumstances of her death to those of Edith Cavell, a British nurse who had been executed by the Germans in 1915. The Catholic press put it down to wooden-headed militarism and published a letter by Father O'Gorman accusing Dr. Elkington of being a hater of priests and parsons generally. The issue united Catholics of all persuasions. Justice Charles Hayden, a pariah to many of his fellow Catholics because of his attacks on Archbishop Mannix during the conscription debates, became a leader of the protests. On the 6th of December, Archbishop Kelly presided at a solemn requiem mass for Annie Egan at the cathedral, which was attended by her parents and a large gathering of leading citizens of the city. The Mass was celebrated in the absence of Nurse Egan's body. She had already been buried at the quarantine station as required by health regulations, prayers over her grave having been said by a fellow nurse. In his sermon, the Archbishop castigated the authorities for the callousness in refusing Nurse Egan's request for a priest. He said, "Let it be remembered that Nurse Egan has won the martyr's crown. They have given her military honours at her funeral, as if she had no soul, as if that were enough. They might lay a Victoria Cross or any other decoration upon her tomb, but they nevertheless denied her dying wish to have her God in the Holy Viaticum." The next day, Kelly wrote to Elkington, renewing his request for the admission of a priest to the quarantine station. In his letter, Kelly wrote that unless the request were granted, without delay, he would personally seek to enter the station. He also cabled Acting Prime Minister Watt, informing him of his intentions. The Apostolic Delegate also wrote to the Acting Prime Minister, adding his protest to the many that were now directed at the government. Although at this time Australia and the Holy See did not have diplomatic relations, the protests of the Apostolic Delegate carried the authority of his office as the Pope's representative in Australia. By Monday, the 9th of December, Watt had not replied to Kelly. The Archbishop, therefore, accompanied by a number of priests, presented himself at the entrance to the quarantine station and requested entry. Members of the press were also in attendance, including a photographer from The Sun, whose pictures were to illustrate newspaper reports of the event. The guard at the gate of the quarantine station politely informed the Archbishop that he would not allow him to pass and that, if he forced entry, he would be arrested. Kelly said that he would not provoke an incident and withdrew. But Kelly had already made his point. His willingness to expose himself to the dreaded disease was seen by some as heroic. Elizabeth Malarkey of Kogarah wrote to him, "Your noble example of self-sacrifice has touched the heart of every true Christian." More significantly, public opinion was now overwhelmingly on his side. Indignation meetings were being held in cities, suburbs and towns across New South Wales. Letters expressing outrage were appearing in metropolitan and regional newspapers throughout the state. Many of the letters were from bishops in Australia and New Zealand, as well as from members of Parliament at both state and federal level. The Catholic Federation of New South Wales had mobilised its members, and letters of protest were received from more than 200 branches. But it was not only Catholics who expressed their disapproval of the government's actions. Even the Sydney Morning Herald, which was generally antagonistic to Catholics, had joined in the criticism of the government over the issue. In the New South Wales Legislative Council, a former Liberal Premier, Sir Joseph Carruthers, a Protestant, moved a motion expressing regret at the actions of the federal authorities. In the Commonwealth Parliament, the issue was also debated. The government was clearly shaken by the strength of feeling in the community, and it needed a way out of the impasse. The decision to refuse to admit ministers of religion into quarantine stations had been taken by the government on the advice of the Commonwealth's medical experts, and those experts were not prepared to change their opinion. Ironically, it was Archbishop Mannix, the Prime Minister's nemesis, who was to broker the settlement that let the government off the hook. After negotiations over a number of days, Massey Green telephoned Mannix and told him that the government was prepared to allow priests into the quarantine station on certain strict conditions proposed by the federal health authorities. This was clearly a political decision. The health authorities had confirmed their advice that clergymen should not be admitted, and had only proposed the conditions in the event the government decided otherwise. For his part, Mannix undertook to recommend to Kelly the acceptance of the proposed solution as the best circumstances would allow. Although the conditions were restrictive, Kelly was prepared to abide by them, though under protest. That afternoon, Massey Green made a statement to the House of Representatives, and the next day the government issued instructions allowing chaplains to be admitted to the station on the stated conditions. But for the particular circumstances of the times, Annie Egan would have died in the same relative obscurity as she had lived. But these were not ordinary times, and as a result, what was essentially a public health issue was transformed into a controversy over religious liberty and the rights of the Catholic minority. Although many Protestant clergy and laity were outraged by the government's action and had expressed support for the stand which Archbishop Kelly had taken, Catholic newspapers detected a sectarian dimension to the affair. The Catholic press reckoned that the Orange Ascendancy party in the federal ministry was to blame, while the Freeman's Journal accused the Anglican primate, Dr. Wright, of allowing Archbishop Kelly to do the fighting on the issue, emerging only after the government had backed down in order to claim that he had been a supporter of the cause all along. These judgments reflect the opinion of many Catholics who by 1918 had grown impatient with the political and social order which, in their perception, treated Catholics as second-class citizens. Looking back from the present, a different judgment seems appropriate. Dr. Elkington's refusal to permit a priest to visit the quarantine station to minister to Nurse Egan can at one level be justified on medical grounds, given the doctor's concerns as to the catastrophic consequences for public health which would flow from a breach of quarantine. Consequences which, with hindsight, can be seen not to have been exaggerated. Nevertheless, given the willingness of the priests to remain in the quarantine station, it is difficult to see how quarantine could have been breached. Public health considerations, therefore, do not provide a complete explanation, though an additional factor might have been the safety of the priests. Issues of public health require careful consideration to be given to competing interests within the community. In this case, one such interest was the religious sensibilities of Catholics, who saw it as an imperative that a priest be available to administer the last rites to Catholic inmates of the quarantine station who might be dying of the disease. A leading Catholic member of the New South Wales Parliament, John Lane Mullins, explained to the Legislative Council, "When a Catholic is confronted by death, the presence of a priest is of infinitely more importance to him than that of all the doctors in the world." It is doubtful whether the public health authorities saw things in those terms. Their responses to requests to allow a priest into the station were initially unconvincing, implying that they did not believe the requests warranted serious consideration. Even when the controversy erupted, the health authorities refused to alter their advice to the government. The approach of the health authorities suggests a secular mindset that heavily discounted the claim of religion as a relevant factor in the formulation of public health policy. This view is consistent with priest historian Edmund Campion's description of Dr. Elkington as a secularist and friend of Norman Lindsay, who shared Lindsay's distaste for religion. The initial refusal of the responsible ministers to reverse Dr. Elkington's decision can be explained without the need to invoke the existence of an orange plot. The politicians knew they would bear ultimate responsibility if they acted contrary to the advice of their health experts, and if the disease were to spread. It is important to note that at the time of the affair, Spanish flu had not yet breached Australia's quarantine, and the public health authorities and the government were hoping to keep it that way. Experience overseas had shown the potential of the epidemic to kill tens of thousands of Australians. Until they received a clear indication of the attitude of the community, the politicians were not prepared to act contrary to the advice they were being given by the health authorities. But once Kelly, by careful manipulation of public opinion, had demonstrated that, unlike the medical authorities, the community appreciated the religious necessity of having a priest attend dying patients, the government, against the recommendation of its chief medical advisor, quickly relented. The controversy over the quarantine station affair disappeared as abruptly as it arose. However, it is a valuable reminder that religion and religious sectarianism in particular have been potent forces in Australia's political and social history. Today, when Australia is confronted by a new pandemic, COVID-19, the antagonisms that were significant a century ago no longer exist. This was illustrated in March 2020 when the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, Anthony Fisher, issued a pastoral letter to the Catholics of the Archdiocese. In the letter, Fisher referred to the Church's cooperation with public health authorities to ensure the safety of all. He then outlined measures to be taken to achieve that cooperation, including the suspension of all public masses and communal devotions. In the present circumstances, the Archbishop's deference to civil authority is unremarkable. What would have been remarkable is a pastoral letter in which the Archbishop asserted that the rights of Catholics trumped the advice of the health authorities. Yet, as we have seen in the case of priests seeking to enter the quarantine station during the Spanish flu pandemic a century ago, Fisher's predecessor Michael Kelly took such an approach, and, remarkably, won. As they say, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Until next time, fare thee well.